hard to relate to that transcendence. The medievals had a concept in the mind. They said there's a point in the mind where we're thinking rationally as hard as we go, and then we come to the point where we can think no more, and we tip over into transcendence. And they call that intellectus. Intellect. And that's similar to the Buddhist notion of buddhi, that capacity of the brain for the transcendent. Now, in the West, unfortunately, since the Enlightenment, intellect has become much narrower, much more sense-bound, much more mundane. I think what we've done is domesticate transcendence. We've dragged it down and made it something manageable, something that we can control and manage and know. And this creates a kind of idolatry, because very often the God that we create is in our own image, and it is not taking us beyond ourselves. And idolatry is scorned, or it's a concern, because it can inspire dreadful behaviour. If you think God is always on your side and thinks as you do, this can give you a divine sanction to commit awful atrocities. And so transcendence keeps that sense that there's always something that we don't know. That is part of the human condition. It depends how you use the term civilization. There are certainly cultural entities where people have developed certain images, certain rituals, certain beliefs, certain ways of doing things, a certain outlook. So you can talk about a Chinese civilization in that respect. You can talk about a Western or Islamic civilization in that respect. But when it becomes a value-laden term, and so that you have the civilized and the non-civilized, then you're on to something that's difficult here. And every culture has had one from the dawn of time. With the Greeks, it was the Greeks and the barbarians. With the Chinese, it was the Chinese and the barbarians, everyone who wasn't us. With the Jews, it was Jew versus Gentile. With Christians, it was everybody that wasn't Christian. And with the moderns, it's everyone that wasn't modern. And I think so that when it's used as a value-laden term, then it can do great harm. It shows that one doesn't respect the civilizational integrity of others. That is a way of doing things that is different from ours and that needs to be respected, not dominated, not exploited. It's not just been these, say, colonial moves have not just been made because of the white man's burden or the desire to civilize the other. I think colonialism in essence was entirely exploitative and economic exploitation. The point of a colony was to go in there, extract its natural resources, take them back or else to be processed under Western auspices, and to flood the local market with cheap Western goods and to find new markets for them. That was its sole object. Yes, it had some camp followers, missionaries and all. And yes, in a sense, in order to fit in with this economic exploitation, certain Western forms had to be imposed on the colonized country in order so that it would function with the Western economy. But I don't think there was a real knowledge or a real desire to civilize the natives. They just wanted their money. But of course, that's not what they tell their people, and that impulse has been largely sanitized. In a sense, we're doing them a favor, bringing railroads and things to people. Americans flying this flag of democracy at the moment. It's just not so much manifest destiny, because the manifest destiny of America was to be isolationist until World War I and World War II. It did not want to colonize the world. It wanted to retreat from the world and create an enclave of right thinking. And part of America's problem is that it doesn't know about the world. It's not used to. This is a new thing for it to interact with other civilizations. Then, when the British Empire failed and the French Empire failed, the Americans took over, unfortunately. Because up until that point they'd been in foreign countries in a sort of commercial capacity, they'd often taken the European colonialists to task for their behaviour. Well, certainly the clash of civilizations has been used as a ploy. In the West particularly, to justify the latest warlike ventures into the Middle East and Afghanistan, and that the idea is that the civilization is inherently opposed to ours. And this has been used to effect, but even now, I would say, after the manifest disaster of some of these policies, this has been causing Americans very much to rethink and revisit this. I think it's become, except among the far right and the last remaining Bushites and the Sarah Palins of this world, I think it is becoming a complete devalued idea. One of the things that we need to do is to find out about one another, to learn about one another. And once you start interacting with human beings and going beneath the surface, behind the sound bites of politicians, to the actual events on the ground, then I think you begin to create a sense of dialogue, a sense of reality out there. And very often the media, for example, through which most people get their information about the rest of the world, and let's face it, most people are busy, they haven't got time to research, other cultures or other religions. They depend on the media for news, but it often presents a very biased, limited view of what's going on. When we hear about Pakistan, for example, in England, it's usually bearded Taliban, caves, some horror. And Egypt, for example, there was recently a massacre of Copts, which was given wide coverage in the Western media, but no real coverage of the response of the Egyptian Muslims to that massacre and how they stood around the church on Christmas Day in a human chain to protect their fellow Egyptians. That kind of qualification needs to be, that kind of information needs to get out there in order so that people have a rounded view of what's going on. Now, as we speak, there is a revolution going on in Cairo, in Egypt. Now, in the United States, though not in Europe, this is being seen simply through the lens of how it will affect Israel. And that, again, is blinkering and slanting the whole American perception of this struggle. So that really what we need to do is the Quran tells us to get to know one another. And that means we have to make an effort to break down stereotypes and provide people with positive information instead of just negative, alarmist news. We need both, because most civilizations are encountering some kind of split at the moment. In Pakistan, you have quite a big split between the people who take a hardline approach and people who take a more liberal approach. Certainly that's true of the United States. It's certainly true in many Middle Eastern countries. It's certainly true in a European country such as Holland. So it's no good going out preaching world peace when you can't get on with your own fellow human beings. It's imperative that we engage worldwide at the same time, because no country stands alone. What happens in Pakistan will have repercussions throughout the whole of the global community. And that is true now of every kind of activity, whether it's economic or political or environmental. We will all impact, we are bound together. So therefore we've got to get along. Now the word dialogue is often used in a pejorative way. Dialogue doesn't mean bludgeoning your conversation partner to accept your point of view. Dialogue means that you have to listen as well as speak, and that you are prepared to go into dialogue in order to change, as we are changed by any human encounter, and perhaps for the better. So dialogue is essential both within a civilization and trans-civilizationally. It's a big problem in Europe, and very often it's fueled a lot by the economy to start with. People bring in people for cheap labour to boost the economy, and then they don't like it when they're there. And the fact is that what they're facing is that something's going to change. Because they've now got a large population of, say, Pakistanis or Turks living in their country, this means their country will change, and change is frightening for people. Just as you found during the colonial period that change was frightening and threatening, and this is happening in a different way in Europe. And their civilizations will change. What I say to the Dutch, for example, is that they were colonialists, as we British were, and they should think that how the subject peoples felt, that when they experienced this sinking fear of the lack of civilizational integrity, this is a pinprick compared with what happened when the colonialists arrived in Muslim countries and changed them forever with power. Change is happening, and that's basically, people are afraid of change. And when people are afraid, that's when they erect barriers against the other and ideological barricades against the other. Democracy in other cultures won't follow the same course as it did with ours. And I think that's what people don't see. If Western policymakers look at a country and don't see some kind of replica of Westminster, for example, they say this is not democracy. And democracy is regarded as a kind of sacred value, and I'm very happy myself to be living in a democracy. But it has its flaws, it has its problems. I mean, people vote for things they don't know anything about. Politicians are so busy gathering votes for their next election that they're not always taking a long-term view on really serious issues. And so democracy, like any human system of organisation, has its flaws, and it's got to blend with the soil in which it finds itself, just as a plant has. If the soil isn't right and if it's not prepared, the plant will wither and die. And so I remember Rafsanjani saying in the last days of Ayatollah Khomeini, with the Ayatollah's approval, that we'll have here a Shiite democracy. Not on the Western model, but our own democracy, one that has grassroots appeal to the masses, to the ordinary people, and not to just a few westernized elite. Because democracy requires participation, and that means that the forms of government have to be accessible and comprehensible to the people who are going to be doing the voting and participating, and not seen as some foreign import imposed on them from without. Democracy takes time to develop. It took us 300 years. We're still not getting it right. I see democracy more as a state of grace, as we would say in the Christian world, rather than an achievement. It's something for which one is continually striving. And so there are going to be sort of hiccups along the way, especially in new democracies. The West has an exaggerated view of Sharia. It's become a sort of bogeyman, and like most bogeymen, people don't know very much about it. That's what makes them a bogey. But Sharia law, after all, the point of it was a system of jurisprudence which changed as things developed. And so this is part of the of the challenge to accommodate Sharia law with a modern industrial virtue, a product of industrial capitalism, with democracy. I think my recent visit to Tehran showed me that they were really trying to secularize, but in a Shiite way. You know, in a way that isn't picked up by Western pundits because they don't understand the Shiite imagery in which this is going on. But there are lots of things that are clearly wrong with that. People, minorities feel oppressed, that kind of thing. And in order to have a functioning democracy, you have to feel free. It's no good saying we're all free to vote and think as we please if there is somebody breathing down your neck, like an imperial power. Now, Iran declared its independence at the time of the revolution and so was ready to create a democracy. But that was a very short time ago, and democracies, there are going to be hiccups. What do you mean? What's the purpose of it? I have no idea. I think if I knew that, I would be a Buddha or a sage. One is we arrive in our world kicking and screaming as we leave our mother's womb. And we are constantly trying to figure it out, what it means. Our religions help us to access this transcendent element. Art and religion help us to find meaning in the perplexity and violence and tragedy in which we find ourselves. They help us to make sense of problems for which there are no easy answers, and to live with them creatively and kindly. But if you were to ask me what the purpose of my life would be, after much trial and error and thrashing around to find a way of living, it is to live in such a way that when I die, the world will be a little bit better because I've been in it.